It's now my pleasant duty to introduce to you the speaker of the day, Dr. Surinder S. Jodhka.
Dear Professor Pradhan, Mr. Nayak, Sachmi Nayak, Dr. Soring, it's indeed a great honor and privilege to be here amongst you, part of this series that you have been very consistently and very committedly pursuing, and also to be honored to be identified or associated with Dr. Ambedkar Chair in itself is a kind of achievement, much more than what was being read here. I am a sociologist. I teach sociology at Jawaharlal Nehru University, as I've been introduced already, and I'm not going to be directly talking about Dr. Ambedkar. I would talk about Indian society, contemporary Indian society, in context of, in a sense, the forces that were set in motion primarily by Dr. Ambedkar, and they have produced many changes, and we need to keep revisiting them. Where do we stand today? Because it's not a simple linear process of progress. It's not like we started 70 years back or 50 years back and now we have climbed 3 steps, and then there are another 3 steps and another 3 steps, and by the time we reach 2020 we would have arrived. That is not going to happen, and that hasn't happened. It's zigzag, and there are many people who are still roaming around with guns trying to destroy everything that Professor Ambedkar or Dr. Ambedkar had achieved, trying to reverse processes or take India into a different direction. Right? So all that is happening simultaneously, and it is happening in different ways. So what I am going to do is to talk about what we understand by caste and how caste is related to what we call power. Now, power is a very complicated concept. It is not something which is simple and straightforward available to us. Normally, when we think about power, we think about politics. We think about democratic politics. We think about elections. We think about reservations. We think about castes and communities that rule India. We think about government policies. We think about chief ministers and prime ministers. But that is not the only thing that power is. There is power here also. The fact that I am speaking from here and I was introduced so nicely, your institute also has a power structure. So power is not always bad. We need to have some kind of system of power, system of governance, system of rights and duties. But then there are powers which contradict human essence. Dr. Ambedkar was all his life trying to develop a level playing field where human beings are treated human beings. If some people are not treated human beings, by whom? Why? That is a kind of power which produces a kind of challenge and problem in society where not only it is morally inhuman, but it is also socially unviable. If we want to call ourselves a democratic society, it is not only a matter of being able to go and vote and elect your representatives. Democracy is also a relationship. When we talk about democracy, it is also about some kind of equality, the idea of citizenship. Every time you open an NCERT book, or when we talk about Indian Constitution, the preamble of Indian Constitution is what India's modern culture is. And that is where the idea of citizenship the idea of India is best articulated. And this is only articulated. How do we achieve it? That is the challenge. And that's where I think contribution of B.R. Ambedkar has been very, very significant in framing that ideal. If India has to be a country, if India has to be a nation state, if we have to be proud of being Indian, we will need to translate what is written in the preamble of the Constitution. We need to have the picture of B.R. Ambedkar here. We need to organize this lecture. We need to talk about what is written in the Constitution because it has yet not been achieved. I wish we didn't have to talk about it. Right? I wish we could take it for granted that now India indeed is a democratic country, and since now it is a democratic country where everyone is equal in principle, there can be economic inequalities, but there can still be equality, like it exists in many of those countries that we are very kind of eager to abuse. Even countries like United States of America, every child goes to a school where the other child goes, the neighborhood school, right? Where the quality of education for every child available is as good as it is for every other child. Though there is race in United States, but still there are many areas where there is level playing field. The idea of equality is something that you can see, you can experience, right? Countries of Europe, countries like Sweden where I lived last year, you can see equality. Not that there are no disparities. There are income disparities, there are rich and there are poor people, but poorest of the poor also has everything that anyone requires. And there is no one who can question his human dignity or human essence. So when we talk about power and caste, we need to understand what are we talking about and why am I speaking on this subject. And if we have to understand the contemporary democratic politics, we also need to understand the sources from where those inequalities, those privileges, violence that we experience in everyday life is able to, in a sense, reproduce itself. Like you have violence in family, right? Husband and wife. We know in like 50 to 70% families, women are not treated well. In many families, women are also beaten up. But this does not become an issue. It does not become an issue for those families. It does not become an issue for those men who beat up their wives. It does not become an issue for those cultures and societies. That is called institutionalized violence, where violence is accepted as a way of life. But is it acceptable? Certainly not. If we have to build a democracy, if we are talking about equality, then equality has to also be equality between men and women. There could be different roles, there could be different positions. Somebody could be a peon in the office and the other one could be principal in the office. But that does not mean that they are not equal. Right? So how does one institutionalize that equality? That's why the idea of democracy was introduced in India. So democracy is not simply about politics of forming government or forming ministries or winning elections. Democracy for Ambedkar is a way of life that needs to be institutionalized in our head, in our relationships, in our institutions, in our society, and only then we can think of having a democratic political system. What we have is very, very superficial. We do have elections every 5 years and we feel very proud of the fact that India has flourishing democracy. But gradually we have seen who are the people who get elected. Right? Not that things have not changed. I will come to that in a short while. A lot has changed. But the point is that privileges remain privileges. There are very few parts of the country where people who were powerful 100 years back are not powerful any longer. They continue to hold a lot of power. And in many ways, if you were to actually look at the empirical fact, they have grown. They have continued to grow, and some of them have grown 100 times, 1,000 times, both in terms of wealth and in terms of influence, in terms of status. And as was being pointed out earlier, 75% of those communities which are listed as scheduled tribes, 50% of those communities which are listed as scheduled castes in your state called Odisha continue to live in miserable conditions. Below poverty line is just a kind of soft name for misery. Right? People who can't even eat food, right? People who can't even wear clothes. Right? Below poverty line is just minimum level of threshold, even that is not available. So how does one think of democracy? How does one think of power in relation to caste? Why are we talking about caste and democracy? I think that's where we need to think about larger systems. When we are talking about institutionalized inequalities, and one of the axes, there are different ways in which one can think of inequalities. We were just talking about man and women. Similarly, there are inequalities based on ownership and non-ownership of land. Inequalities between, say, Odisha and Kerala. Right? There are some states which are very rich, there are some states which are very poor. Within Odisha, there are inequalities. If you are living in the city of Bhubaneswar, and you just go perhaps even 20 miles from here, and you would find a region where you would not even see one single room which is pakka. Right? There are no fans. There is no electricity. Right? So there are all kinds of inequalities. And caste is one aspect of that inequality. Right? And in India, it sometimes becomes the most critical, because land ownership is linked to the caste system. Housing is linked to caste. Where government will build plants and factories is also linked to the influence and power of certain people who belong to certain communities and castes. So caste becomes a very, very powerful instrument through which inequality germinates into different spheres, whether it is agriculture, whether it is industry, whether it is urban and rural, whether it is education, whether it is culture, music, performance. You find inequality everywhere. And caste seems to be working very, very effectively. So how does one look at caste? How do we think of building an equal society? Like she was saying, as long as caste is there, humiliation will be there, degradation will be there. I think that's a very, very important point. Right? But over the years, things have not happened the way Dr. Ambedkar had expected. Right? To some extent, perhaps, after our understanding of the way societies change, we also need to revise, and people have revised Ambedkar's opinion in politics. For example, when Kanshiram wanted to do politics, he thought caste is not going away. So what do? He thought it's perhaps good idea to organize around caste so that you can build a competitive caste politics. And in many ways he was very successful. And that is something which we need to discuss and think about. Very interestingly, if we look at the history of Indian society, modern history of Indian society after independence or just before independence, when India was trying to think about becoming a modern society during the colonial period, later years of colonial period, after independence, when constitution was being framed, Ambedkar was obviously not the only person who was involved in it. There were a large number of other people, leaders from different political parties, different parts of India, were actively involved in the process of constitution making. India, as you know, also started something called planning for development. India was one of the countries which had very visionary economists and other social scientists who helped Government of India, people like Nehru, who appears to be a very well-meaning person sometimes, who helped him think about change, how to change society. We don't really have to wait for 100 years or 200 years for things to change on their own. So development planning was introduced in India. But the idea, underlying assumption was that once India starts development planning, there would be a process of what was called as modernization. That India will become a modern society. What we need to do is to just open the gates. Right? We need to start industrialization and then it would pick up. Government can give some incentive, start democracy, then it would pick up. Right? Once we start education, everyone would become modern because being modern was good. Right? So modernization was seen as a process which would happen on its own. And except for Ambedkar, everyone else thought that we don't need to talk too much about caste. Caste was part of our tradition. It was a kind of symptom of old age. And as we recultivate ourselves, we will become younger or we would move ahead and caste would disappear on its own. It was some kind of dark ages and we just need to light up lamps. And once the lamps are lighted up, darkness will go away. So there was a complete lack of political approach towards caste. Caste was even if it exists, how does it matter? Right? But Dr. Ambedkar insisted that we need to have legal provisions because on its own, caste will not go away. He was the only one who was arguing on these lines. Everyone else thought that process of modernization will take care of all these problems. Like village will disappear, we will become modern like the Western countries, and caste would also disappear. So it was because of those factors that we have a different perspective on caste emerging. That caste is also about power. Caste is also about humiliation, where some human beings are not considered as human beings. They are treated less than human beings. People like Nehru, for example, very openly said that it's just a matter of tradition and gradually caste would give way to modern society. In modern society, things like caste would not survive. They also thought about democracy, that politics, democratic politics, once you introduce electoral politics, we would need to destroy caste, and democratic political process, because it is based on the idea of single vote and everyone has equal right to participate, will automatically destroy caste. Now, the social scientists or political scientists who were working on democratic politics by 1960s, even before, they begin to notice that caste was not going away. Democracy was obviously having its impact. It's not like nothing was changing, but caste seemed to be reappearing in a different format. There were two scholars who were both Americans, they're still alive, Rudolph and Rudolph, husband and wife, and they started working on what is happening to caste in democratic politics. When elections happen, they figured out that Indian tradition or caste system was like plastic. It was very flexible. Right? And there was a process in which it was getting modernized. That caste, for example, in the rural society would be a hierarchical system, but people would come to cities, even in urban areas, they would be living in caste localities. There would be caste associations, there would be caste-based hostels, and caste-based elections, caste-based candidates. Now we think it is normal and natural because everyone talks about politics in caste terms, but in 60s, this was something very new. That caste was very successfully entering democratic politics, and instead of individual voting for candidates, it was groups, caste-based vote banks that were able to kind of dictate the logic of politics. They thought that it was something very interesting. This is something which nobody expected, and India is turning out to be a very, very fascinating case of a place where traditions can modernize themselves and become part of democratic system. So they use the word civil society. that in India you don't have the kind of civil society that existed in the West, which was association of individuals coming together. So caste can become like civil society. Right? They were absolutely wrong, because civil society is a modern institution. Can caste become modern in real sense of the term? Is something that they were not willing to look at. There is this very well-known political scientist called Rajni Kothari. He wrote a book in 1970 called Caste and Politics in India. And he also continued with that thesis and very proudly claimed that it is not only caste that is entering democratic politics, but it is also democratic politics that is entering caste. So there is a politicization of caste, and now what we have are caste associations. Now this is a very strange kind of conceptualization. Right? Now, what he is trying to argue is that caste in modern democratic politics is not only present, but it is also good. Because this is not old kind of caste. This is where people come together on their own, of their choice. It might be a Brahmin Mahasabha or Agarwal Sabha or some other community, but you have to join as individual. So what is wrong with it? If you look at different parts of the country, Odisha, I think still Brahmin dominance is much more than some other states. If you look at the neighboring state of Andhra Pradesh or UP or Bihar or Karnataka or Punjab, Haryana. So what happens in 1960s, by 60s, there is a change happening in the political scene. The top level Brahmin, Baniya, caste groups are being displaced from politics by these agriculturally powerful caste communities. Jats, Reddis, Kammas, Patels, Vokaligas, Lingayats, in different parts of the country. I don't know much about Odisha, so I will not say anything. But I'm sure here also there would have been what are now called as the OBCs or the upper OBC caste. They were not really OBCs, they were upper castes. But they were rural. They were from agricultural background. They were large in numbers, but they were not the old urban educated communities. So they were talking only about them. That they were able to participate in politics, but the fact is that their active participation in politics also meant that Dalits could not participate in politics. I remember in late 80s I was doing my field work in Haryana, and it was a frequent thing until 1980s in different parts of North India that Dalits will not be allowed to even go to vote. Right? The moment they enter the voting booth, they would be told that you have already casted your vote. He said, I have not come here. No, you see, your vote has already been cast. Somebody has done it, so now you can't do it again. There was something called booth capturing. It was Bihar and UP were very notorious that the whole booth will be captured by one gang leader, and they were all caste leaders. So what we see is by 1970s or 1980s, we have a new kind of politics, which is democratic politics of elections, of state and central governments, but it is a politics of caste groups. The rise of regional politics in India is very closely linked to the consolidation of this particular block of castes, and the source of their power was their control over land. They more or less owned all the agricultural land, and after independence, when Nehru introduced land reforms, many of these communities, they were able to acquire land. Even those who were earlier tenants, land reforms did not help Dalits much, because Dalits were seen as people who can only be landless laborers, because they did not have titles. When tenancy reforms happened, land was given only to those people who were actually cultivating land. And most parts of India, land was not given to Dalits at all. In Punjab, for example, in Haryana, less than 1% of agricultural land belongs to Dalits. In some areas, there are a larger number of Dalits who have land, but their plots are very, very small. But in 1990s, we see something interesting happening. That the old kind of caste politics relationship begins to kind of weaken. And there's something new happening around that time, and that is a kind of disintegration of the old kind of complete dominance of upper and dominant caste over politics. There is some possibility for Dalit to participate effectively in electoral politics. And it is around this time that you have rise of parties like Bahujan Samaj Party. Now, how could it happen? This is in a sense a puzzle, that we have not seen any kind of Dalit revolution. Right? There is hardly any place where Dalits got together and tried to actively participate in politics with violence or anything else. Bahujan Samaj Party, many people had tried earlier also. As you know, Ambedkar had started this political party called Republican Party, and it also was, in a sense, it was not confined to Maharashtra. They formed its units in different parts of the country. But Republican Party could never succeed. So by 90s, we have the emergence of a new kind of Dalit politics, which is historically very different from the kind of politics that existed in 1960s and 1970s and up to 1980s. What explains that? Where did it come from? Now, we must recognize that we are not talking about one country. When we are talking about India, we are talking about many countries. The patterns of change, the patterns of development, patterns of caste assertion vary significantly from region to region. What is happening in Maharashtra is very different from what is happening in Gujarat. What is happening in Gujarat is very different from what is happening in Odisha. What is happening in Odisha is again very different from what is happening in the neighboring state, West Bengal, and then you can think of Bihar, UP, Punjab, Haryana, South India. So there are regional stories, there are regional patterns. But despite these regional patterns, there are also pan-Indian trends. The fact that we have one constitution, the fact that we have one parliament, the fact that we have one kind of, more or less similar kind of educational system. People like us, all of us sitting here, all of us travel quite a lot. And those of you are younger, you will also travel a lot. You look for jobs. You're not going to go back to your home. You're not going to go to live in the village. Even if you go and work in a village, you would not stay in one village. So all of us travel. And travel gives us a different kind of idea. Somebody with my background is speaking here in Odisha today, right? Because I get known by my books, because I travel, because they travel. Right? So there is a new middle class culture or new kind of national level identity that has evolved over the last 100-150 years. It started during the colonial period. That's how nationalism could develop. Indian National Congress was because of the emergence of urban centers. But regional variations are very significant. So I'm not speaking for everyone, because local processes one needs to understand, because caste system is able to change only when realities have changed on ground. So the question that I have in mind is, what explains the rise of Dalit politics in 1990s? I have been working on this. I have also written on this. And I feel there are 4 or 5 factors which are responsible for this. In last 50 years of India's development, we have had not only introduction of democracy, but some kind of economic change also. And in some areas, that economic change has been very rapid. In some areas, that economic change has been slower. We have emergence of cities like Bhubaneswar, Chandigarh, or many other new urban centers which did not even exist earlier. And there is also process of urbanization. Other cities are also growing. Some smaller settlements are becoming bigger. Economic development in rural areas has played a very, very important role. And I think that is something which Ambedkar was the only one who visualized that we need to transform our village, because village is the site where caste operates in the purest form. Because of several factors, development, democracy, demographics, over the last 60 years we have seen disintegration of the village. The kind of village that existed even 50 years back does not exist any longer. Notwithstanding differences, regional variations, we had a kind of village society. And this village, almost everywhere in India, a lot of variations. In some parts of the country, you don't have villages. We don't have rural settlement. You have household after household after household, homestead lands. But wherever you had village, invariably, what would happen in an Indian village, that there would be some families who controlled the village. Right? They owned almost all the agricultural land. There would be some priests, some traders, some other people who would be part of that cluster of so-called dominant communities or upper castes and middle-level caste groups. Some of them around them would be working with them as small farmers or peasants or whatever you like to call. And then there was an untouchable colony which would also work for the village. They were not all involved in caste occupation. Caste occupation was only 10-15%. In Punjab, I know, there would be 90 families of one untouchable caste. 5 of them are involved in caste occupation. Rest of them were all agricultural laborers. So they helped these bigger castes, powerful communities, to cultivate land, and the entire village society was controlled by 5 or 6 patriarchs, people who were elderly men from the upper castes. And they controlled everything. If somebody tried to do something which they didn't like, that person could be eliminated. There were very strong social sanctions. Normally, nobody would try to do anything. But if they tried, they would be punished physically, publicly, in presence of everyone, so that others don't dare to do that. So it appeared to be very kind of peaceful society, but it could also be very violent society, because it was very unequal society. Again, there were lots of variations. One is not really going into that. But more or less, that is how it was. Now, after independence, we have had introduction of democracy, politics that we were just talking about. Elections were held, but Dalits were never allowed to vote initially for first 30, 40, 50 years, not just 5 years. But then what happens is that all these people who were at the top, they are able to access all the development benefits. Right? Wherever in states like Punjab, Haryana, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, perhaps also parts of Odisha, where government introduced new irrigation schemes, started giving them loans to buy tractors, new kind of seeds came in. You have this thing called green revolution. Agricultural development begins to happen. And who benefits out of it? You have Gandhi's community development program, or you have cooperatives. Who benefits? The entire social science literature says that it was these 10% or 20% or 40% people from the upper caste, dominant communities, those who owned agricultural land, they benefited. But then that benefit is not simply in terms of power. It also changes their aspirations. It also changes their lifestyles. So this small class of people begins to gradually look towards the city. That village is not where their future is. Right? There is also some pressure because by 70s you have some kind of change happening and larger number of people can afford to assert. In my area where I did my field work in Haryana, I saw by 1970s all the Baniyas, the Marwadis, people who were traders, local money lenders who controlled agriculture, they had begun to leave the village. They thought that in village now they don't matter any longer. The local Jats who had become rich because of Green Revolution, they will borrow money from them but will not return back the money. So these Baniyas realized that whatever resources we have, it's better we go to the town and invest it there. Otherwise, we will get killed or we'll lose whatever we have. So they were smart people. So the first ones to move out were these Baniyas and Brahmins, people who did not have large numbers, smaller families, but they had resources. They were rich. They were not poor. And they realized that cities is where the future lies. So they will be able to educate their children, they'll be able to live better, and they would still have control over these people. They went to the town and became commission agents. So now the farmers would bring their farm yield to them because they were known to each other, and they would take their commission and they became much more richer and powerful in the urban context. But that also increased some kind of competition in the village life. Right? There were new people who became very powerful. Right? And their power was very different from the power of the upper castes, the old upper castes. The old upper castes had their own way of doing it. So they started competing with each other. Right? Because elections every year, elections every second, third year, some election or the other. So there was a new kind of democratic competition, not exactly democratic, but factional politics. By 70s, you see in rural areas very strong factional politics. 2 or 3 families, again, are the ones who are the richest landowners. They begin to compete with each other. And in this competition, Dalits' vote also becomes significant. Right? And this competition is not confined to the village. This competition extends to the region. So there are different communities that are competing with each other for power. And democracy is not something which was a simple process of reproducing power. So democracy began to change things. Second important factor, which again, what I was saying, unfolding of the processes that were unleashed by Dr. Ambedkar, reservation. I mean, nobody has so far actually assessed the significance of reservation. History will tell us reservation has played a very, very important role in opening India, in making India a possibly democratic country. If we did not have reservation, things would have been much, much worse in every sense. I'm not talking about job reservations. Job reservations have also played their role in producing a kind of Dalit middle class. We'll come to that later. But in rural areas, in small towns, you have reservation for, even in panchayats, there is reservation for scheduled caste. In the state assemblies, there is reservation for scheduled caste and scheduled tribe. In parliament, there is reservation for scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. Initially, when Nehru was the prime minister, how did they identify who would contest from the seat reserved for scheduled caste or scheduled tribe? There was no leadership of the community. They would just identify one person and would say, you contest elections. But India is a big country. Right? And every state has an assembly. Every constituency has an MP. Over 4 or 5 elections, just you think of the number of people who have had the experience of sitting in parliament for 5 years, who have had the experience of sitting in state assembly for 5 years, or who have had the experience of contesting election from an opposition seat and belonging to scheduled caste or scheduled tribe. Their number was initially in hundreds, then became in thousands, and now tens of thousands, or maybe hundreds of thousands. People who have had the experience of being sitting in parliament. Right? Parliament has how many? Nearly 100 reserved seats, perhaps more than 100 reserved seats. Right? 150 reserved seats. 150 reserved seats in every parliament. And when you go to Delhi and live in Delhi, in a posh area, it's not something which has no impact on you. It gives you confidence. Right? It gives you all the other resources that other MPs have. You can also distribute those largesse. Those who've been MPs, they would tell you, being an MP is a big thing. Not because you are in Delhi and you are in Parliament. Now things have become easier. Earlier, telephone, you have quota for telephone, you have gas connection quota, you can get train ticket booked, all kinds of things that could be distributed. So there was a new constituency that began to develop. And this was something which was very different and something that people have not studied. The impact of developing new Dalit leadership, which came from ground, and they gradually acquired confidence. Right? Obviously, reservation for jobs. Reservation of jobs means initially the first generation, if you were to look at biographies of people who are doing very well from Dalit background, their grandparents would have joined government jobs as class 4 employees. Some of them perhaps would have joined as class 3 also. But mostly because there is no education in the family, but there are jobs available in the government sector, in the railways, in other departments. But when you get a regular job, you go to the city. Once you go to the city, Ambedkar said you must educate. Right? These people would all want their children to get educated. And then gradually that begins to expand. And again, if you want to quantify the number, it's unimaginable. Somebody like Kashiram. Kashiram was born in a Sikh Dalit family in Punjab, and he took up some job and he goes to Pune, and there he realizes that, I have become an officer, but nobody talks to me. The only other person who wants to talk to me is another Dalit. The upper caste people always know that I am a Dalit. So what is the point in my mobility? So he started organizing scheduled caste employees in the offices. Office is another very important political institution which has not been studied by social scientists. So office becomes an arena of competition, conflict, envy, of violence of different kinds. People begin to organize around caste lines. It was very bad. We think it is very bad. But why did it happen? It happened because Indian society was divided on caste lines. So people who used to earlier hide their caste came out in open. And then people said, okay, if this is how, unless I take my whole community along, I can't go ahead, then I better do that. So by 90s, you have people like Kashiram who begin to openly claim caste identity. Right? That we will not hide the fact that we are Dalits. In fact, we will use the Dalit identity and mobilize ourselves. There's another thing that is happening at the ground level in rural areas. By that time, it becomes much more clear that it is not only the upper caste who are moving out of the village, but it is also at the lower level that things are changing. Like in Punjab and Haryana, when Green Revolution becomes successful, every farmer has tractor. They want to produce for the market. They want to produce 3 crops in a year. Earlier, laborer who were Dalits used to work with them as bonded slaves, and they would get some share from whatever was produced. Now these big farmers did not want them to work as attached laborers with them. They wanted to hire labor on contract basis, quickly finish the job, use machines, give them wages in cash. Right? So these laborers were released. They didn't have anything to do. Right? So what do? And once they are released, there is also no power that these families could enjoy over these people because they were not their bonded slaves any longer. Right? Now Punjab needs labor, Haryana needs labor, Maharashtra needs labor, Coastal Andhra needs labor. Where does labor go from? They go from Eastern UP, they go from Bihar, they go from Odisha. So the laborer, a Dalit or an OBC laborer who migrates from a village of Odisha to Vishakhapatnam, his life is changed. Right? And it is not only his life changed, his family's life is also changed. Women who stayed back were forced to cultivate land. on their own, whatever little was left. And when they go to work in the village, their experience is very different. So that in a sense transforms the rural life. By early 90s, village begins to fragment itself. Village is no longer the old unit. I revisited 2 of my villages in Haryana where I did field work in late 80s, again in 2008 and 9. What I found was something very interesting. There are many things that I found, but one thing that I want to quote here is that the power of old patriarch, where each village was controlled by 2 or 3 families, that had begun to disintegrate. Nobody cared for them. And these patriarch, they had big havelis, big houses, they looked tall, everything for them was, they looked like powerful people. That had all disappeared. Some of them had died, but their children also became shopkeepers. Right? Now, if you look at the holding structure, there are very small number of farmers in India who have large holdings, land holdings. Most holdings are very small, and they work with their family labor. So the old kind of village has disappeared almost everywhere. Right? It's a much more downsized village. It's a much more insignificant settlement. You can't find person who is powerful. Who becomes sarpanch? In most parts of India, I would guess, sarpanches are younger people, not people in their 60s. They are the ones who are in their 30s, entrepreneurs, people who can help others, who can take somebody along to the town and get their ration card made, can get them Narega job. Right? Big people can't do that. They have never done that. They were patriarchs. So these kinds of factors transformed the village life, transformed democratic politics at the regional level. Right? Politics became much more competitive. Right? Dalits began to participate much more actively in politics. And it is the moment when they begin to participate more actively through their own agency, they would do whatever they wanted to do, that you have violence starting. She again was referring to violence. If you look at caste atrocities, this is not something which used to be there earlier. It starts again sometime in the 80s or more so in the 90s. Right? It's after the 1990s that we begin to hear about very, very violent incidents. Earlier there would be one boy who is not listening to anybody. The boy can be, controlled in one way or the other, occasionally killed. But now you have the communities attacking communities. Right? So the whole Dalit community, their huts are burnt. And this happens because of the possibility of Dalit assertion. The Dalits begin to say that we will act on our own because the overall structure of authority has in a sense disintegrated. Where do we stand today? At some level, the old relationship of caste and power has considerably weakened. And we are in this new liberal India where growth rate has been significantly higher in last 20 years than it was before that. We were hearing about billionaires even in states like Odisha. Their number is very large. India is land of many rich people. The amount of wealth you have in India today in many ways would be many, many times higher than what it was 30 years back. India is not a poor country. But Indians continue to be very poor. The number of Indians who are very poor is still very large. So how do we think of new liberal India from a caste perspective? My study, overall literature, even though violence has increased, even though we have now lots of problems, there is a process of democratization. The power of caste is not what it used to be 30 years back. It is questioned at every moment. There is much more competitiveness, and no Dalit today thinks of herself or himself as a subordinate person. There is a sentiment that I want equal rights. If somebody violates those rights, young kids, even in remote Chhattisgarh or Orissa or parts of Jharkhand, they would come together and form an Ambedkar association. Ambedkar was born in Maharashtra, but nobody thinks he is Maharashtrian. Ambedkar is God. And Ambedkar is God to Dalits of all varieties. In Maharashtra he is known as Mahar, but in Odisha he is known as Ambedkar Dalit leader. Nobody knows his caste. They don't need to. So he's become a symbol of Dalit identity, Dalit assertion, Dalit citizenship, Dalit rights, and aspiration for equality. But is it possible in today's India? The answer, unfortunately, is clear no. Why is it not possible? The kind of economic development we are having at the moment is creating all kinds of problems. In the beginning, I was trying to tell you, the privileges in India have not declined. So what we have in India, in the neoliberal India, the old kind of hierarchy that existed in the village of caste has significantly declined, but there's new hierarchy of networks. At middle level, at lower level, there's a possibility that people can come in, go out. But if you look at the actual economic processes where question of wealth and along with wealth power are related, things are pretty bad for Dalits. They are quite closed, not only for Dalits but also other sections of marginalized communities, whether it is Muslims or tribals, lower OBCs who have been landless. You can pick up anything. Education, for example. Increasingly there is, I studied in a government school. Many people who did very well in my generation, they went to government schools. Everyone went to government schools. There were very few private schools. There were some convents run by Christian missionaries. Not any longer. Even the remote villages, you would find a private English medium school. Right? The government schools, where teachers get much higher salaries, schools that have much better infrastructure, are schools where only Dalit kids go. In Punjab, Haryana, I have actually seen this. These are called as Harijan schools or Dalit schools. Right? So in city of Delhi, for example, you have 3 or 4 different types of schools, or 5 types of schools. There are schools for very rich people, where even our children cannot go. And then there are schools for people like us, who are very good schools and expensive, but not very expensive. If you spend 10,000 rupees per month for a child, you can send. But who can spend 10,000 rupees? Right? And then there are schools which are for lower middle class, and then there are schools where no study education is done, where poor people go. And teachers have contempt for those children. Right? So you have a new kind of economy, corporate sector. Right? In the government sector, jobs are declining. Even though there is more fair representation, there are Dalits in class 1 job, class 2 job, they were much lesser earlier. But the absolute number of jobs available is actually declined in the reserved category. Posts are not being filled. At the lower end, that was the entry point, which is very, very important. For new people who are experiencing mobility, where would they go? Entire class 4 employment is outsourced. It is done by private companies, agencies. Even in government departments, this is done by private agencies. There's very little hiring that happens at the lowest level. And that's where the new middle class has the potential to emerge. And I'm talking about empirical processes. I'm not talking about any kind of, I'm not cynical as such. But this is what is happening. And now these private agencies, they are all kinship based. They are all village based. Right? If I have to recruit 500 people and have to run a security agency or supply labor to some company, I would pick up people of my own community. Right? People I can trust, people I can mobilize, people I would like to favor. And obviously, reservation you cannot talk about. Right? And then there is whole culture of networks. Again, something on which research is just beginning to be done. How do we get hired in the corporate sector? And we have done study, research. You have done MBA, you have done engineering, you have been to the best institute in the country, and you go for interview. You have not written your caste in the CV, but the person who is interviewed will try to find out what is your caste. And I did that survey of corporate hiring managers in Delhi. Almost every one of them said that we do ask about family background. So what is the family background? When you talk about family background, what they are trying to find out is whether you come from certain kind of communities, and if you come from those communities, then you are not likely to be hired, because this will create discomfort in the shop floor, in the office where these officers sit. I think I'll stop here. The challenges are many. It's not going to be simple. So my feeling is that conflict in India is going to increase. And caste is far from a forgotten thing. It's something else today. It is not what it used to be. It's not simply just reproducing itself. But inequality overlaps with these kind of identities. And it's not only the Dalit, but Muslim is marginalized even more than Dalit. The kind of prejudice that you have against the Muslim, a poor Muslim who comes from struggling background, there's very little chance of Muslim getting a job in the organized sector. That's why they are largely in self-employed sector. Scheduled tribes experience their own kind of difficulties. And increasingly, the kind of discourse we have in politics of governance, we've been hearing a lot about corruption in the last 2 years. This whole discourse of governance is not only caste blind, it is also actually in many ways, if you look at it carefully, it's very anti-Dalit. And that's something which we can talk about. Thank you very much.